Perhaps no other event changed the trajectory of the Christian religion than the birth of Islam. As for Jews, who comprised a large part of the population of Arabia during Islam's earliest days, the rise and development of the new Arabian faith, which transformed the political and religious history of Europe and the East, affected Jewish life more profoundly than any development since the triumph of Christianity. In the year 610 A.D. by the Christian calendar, a 40-year-old man named Muhammad lived in the region known as the Hejaz, specifically outside a small oasis village called Mecca in what is modern-day western Saudi Arabia. Although Muhammad's true age is quite in question, sources run the gambit. In Volume 4 of Ibn Kathir, he collected the various sources on Muhammad's age at the time of his first marriage to Khadijah. Al-Zori stated he was 21 years of age when he married. It was also said that he was 25 and the marriage took place around the time the Kaaba was being constructed. Other scholars state that his age was 30. Hakim B. Hizam is quoted as having said, "The age of the Messenger of God was 25 years of age the day he married Khadijah." Ibn Abbas is quoted as having said that Khadijah was 28 years old. Ibn Asakir gives both these accounts. This type of confusion about dating and events is indicative of early Islam. Originally, all Islamic history was carried and learned by word of mouth, retained by special men called the Qurra. After a particularly heinous battle called Yomama, the second and third generation of Muslim leaders were concerned that of the Qurra, most were killed in battle. They feared losing the memory of these quasi-priests. They then set out to document the Quran by gathering manuscripts and portions of manuscripts from all over the Islamic world, condensing and presenting a work as cohesive and from God himself. When Muhammad first began his conquest, no thought at all was given to documenting a worldwide religion. With the Byzantine Empire on one side and the Persian Empire on the other, the area was by no means completely uncivilized as some have imagined. However, most of the region was arid, dry steppes. Many lived by tending herds and raiding rival tribes. The ground was thus well laid for the triumph of a new force, the inspired army of Islam, which was soon to emerge from the Arabian desert to destroy both the Persian and Byzantine empires. Mecca was home to the Al-Kaaba al-Musharrafa, or the Kaaba, as natives knew it, a polytheistic temple that held hundreds of idols of all types before Islam later repurposed it. Paganism had pervaded the Arab culture of the time, but Allah actually already existed in the form of being a God of all gods type figure. Some Arabs of the time converted to Judaism, and others to Christianity, but others found little contentment in these options, desiring what they considered a pure monotheism. They were known in Arabia as Hanifs. That being said, the Jewish population in Arabia was strong and thriving. Their names were Arabic, their speech was Arabic, and some of the finest works in early Arabic literature was the product of Jewish poets and singers. In fact, Abram Leon Sachar wrote that the Jewish culture was so advanced in its settlement of the region compared to the natives of the more inhospitable regions that there was resentment toward them. Muhammad would have 13 wives in his lifetime, ranging in age from 9 years old to his widowed older first wife, Khadijah. He had first married the widow named Khadijah bin Khuwailid in about the year 595 AD, who also happened to be his employer at the time they met, and whose sister was a Catholic nun in a convent. According to Muslim chronicles, their marriage was a happy one and completely monogamous. Khadijah had handed her affairs over to Muhammad to run, making him very wealthy and enhancing his reputation further in the process. He would have many children. Some died, while others may have been stepchildren or adoptions. In some cases, Muhammad seemed to marry for the purpose of improving the lives of women in hardship who had converted to Islam. This point has been used to justify Muhammad's marriage to at least one prepubescent girl. With seed money secured, Muhammad became wealthy in time based on commerce of the region. Mecca's economy relied on caravan trade, especially into Christian Syria. Through those routes, Muhammad had a great deal of exposure to Judaism and Christianity, but as history notes, he could not read or write. Therefore, most of his understanding of religion or Christ, if with the eye to his future he had any, came through observation and conversation. He assimilated scraps of information that intrigued him. The biblical phraseology which he gleaned from Jews and Christians was fragmentary and inaccurate. Almost to the end of his life, he did not distinguish between the sister of Moses and the mother of Jesus. The much more advanced forms of religious worship among the Jewish Arabs and Abyssinian Christians inspired wonder in the Arab natives that manifested into a strange combination of resentment and fear, particularly the ease with which they read and wrote. Muhammad eventually came to spend a great deal of time in a particular cave called Mount Hira, where allegedly the angel Gabriel appeared to him in solitude. All his life he was a prey to melancholy and given to strange fits. He often alarmed his intimates when his trances rendered him virtually unconscious and left him thoroughly exhausted. At some point, what he interpreted as contemplations became some sort of spiritual experience where Muhammad started being visited by what he first believed to be a jinn, a spirit he thought was haunting him. This fact would become important to more fundamental Protestant apologetic regarding the God of Islam. Judeo-Christian translation would identify the jinn as a disembodied demonic spirit, or specifically Nephilim. Some have even sought to prove by comparing the word origin of many ancient biblical languages that the very word Allah translates to Satan. By extension, other terms, such as the Hebrew word for the Islamic symbology of the crescent and stars, is halal. There are also interesting intersections of Arabic Quranic terms connected by Christian fundamental scholarship with the fallen angels, fallen ones, and Lucifer. To those individuals, what makes these links compelling are the biblical understanding of the division of peoples by Esau and Jacob, and the conflict that arose from their differences. These Christians can't help but note that at no time in Christian history was an individual ever visited by the divine, but initially confused that an evil spirit, and not the Spirit of God, had visited them. Gabriel accordingly kept telling Muhammad to recite or read, to which Muhammad replied, "I cannot read." Even with that seeming setback, the visits continued over a period of time, while the angel instead taught Muhammad by rote, overseeing him as he memorized the teachings. Muhammad justified his divine experience by noting that he was illiterate but still had been able to retain God's word for later literary transmission, although such transmission would not occur till after his death. From the years 610 through about 622 AD, Muhammad taught and preached his new lessons around Mecca to the chagrin of his family. He was often beaten badly and his message widely unpopular in the polytheistic city where he preached that there was only Allah. According to Muhammad, none of the idols were of any accord. He did gain followers during that time with his simple message. There is one God, he said, maker of heaven and earth. Early on, Muhammad was well respected and known as an honest man. He was so respected, in fact, that when those in Mecca, threatened by the amount of power he had gained and converts he had won, attacked him and sent them fleeing into Ethiopia, they greeted he and his followers warmly and allowed them to stay in safety. Eventually, the people of the Yathrib, or as known today, Al-Medina, gladly gave them refuge back in Arabia. It was in that year, 622 AD, that the Muslim calendar began. In Mecca, Muhammad had been little more than an illiterate inconvenience. But here in the Yathrib, he gained political, religious, and military power. The two early periods of the faith, both the 12 years in Mecca and the period after in Medina, would be laid out in that sequence in what later became the Quran, although initially the faith was only handed down by word of mouth. The Mecca period dealt with the doctrine and recitations of the faith, whereas the Medina period related to the political and military struggle that marked Islam's growth. The faith had grown by arms mostly, but with the promise of benefit for those agreeing to subjugation or conversion, and death to those who would not agree. For a long time, Muhammad's entire following comprised about 100 loyal men and their families, but these were enough. It seemed that most of Islam's early conquests were retributions for various reasons. Most in his region never forgot his hand-to-mouth upbringing after he began claiming himself as a prophet, and they sometimes referred to him as a palm sprung from a dunghill. Muhammad really shined as the head of an army, though, and sacked and successfully subjugated Mecca for their treatment of he and his followers earlier in his life. In that, one aspect of jihad was born. Once in Medina, Muhammad took full charge, and in just a short time went from being religiously inclusive of those that belonged to other faiths in the region to requiring obedience to himself as the prophet, including the local Jewish tribes. During that period, Muhammad tricked and captured several thousand under the Jewish Banu Qurayza tribe, the same Jews that Muslims relied on when first arriving near Al-Medina. As it turned out, that hospitality was not welcomed but tolerated until they were strong enough to take by force what they wanted. Muhammad's forces robbed and evicted 2 of 3 Jewish tribes, the Banu Kanuga and the Banu Nadir. The Banu Qurayza was a peaceful tribe of farmers and tradesmen that simply surrendered to Muhammad's desire for leadership of the region. They just wished to live in peace. However, Muhammad's life spent constantly looking over his shoulder must have gotten the better of him. Someone in Muhammad's camp determined that the Banu Qurayza had been treacherous to the Prophet. The hadith was not clear in exactly what way or why. No one quite knew what that meant, but Muhammad responded not with the mercy of a prophet or wise man, but by beheading all 800 men in the middle of the street. He then sold the rest of the women and children into slavery. It is possible that his treatment of the Jews came from his interactions with them during the early Medina period. He was anxious to win them over to his cause because they were the wealthiest inhabitants. An alliance and access to good interest rates from Jewish loans would have given Muhammad a great deal of prestige and strength. Initially, Muhammad even showed solidarity with the Jews, asking his followers to fast alongside them on the Day of Atonement, citing that they were, after all, distant relatives, having come from Ishmael through Abraham. This was to no avail as Muhammad's behavior became more and more violent. The Jews and Christians refused to loan he and his followers money except at very high interest. During the Al-Medina period, Muhammad also killed all those who spoke out against him, even one woman who had simply written political satire in a local news source sarcastically speaking of his oppression. He had her beheaded. His ruthless behavior horrified all the inhabitants of the region. Anytime he wanted to justify something dishonorable, but that would result in material gain, he claimed another revelation just in time to justify his actions. The reality was that Muhammad became the model of behavior for all of Islam, which, while it included the Shahada, also included what one would consider today as greedy, lustful materialism, murder, genocide, stealing, covetousness, rape, and simply taking what one may want by force, regardless of the cost in human blood. By 630 AD, Muhammad finally rode back into Mecca, virtually unopposed this time, and took control for he and his band of Muslims. He died only a few years later, but not before allegedly handing down his teachings verbally. Part of his teachings included 5 daily prayers. Islamic prayer was formed with the view that Jews angered God and that Christians went astray. These words were and still are contained in one of the 5 daily prayers said by Muslims around the world. Muhammad confirmed that fact in an early hadith when asked who it could be that angered God and went astray. Was it Jews and Christians? To which Muhammad said, "Who else could it be?" According to Islam, to worship Jesus is to commit an act called shirk, the only unforgivable sin. Therefore, Christians are in a constant state of shirk. Shirk also includes worshiping anyone or anything but Allah, the one true God. In the 4 centuries leading up to the First Holy Land Crusade in the 1090s AD, Islam wreaked havoc on the Levant, North Africa, Constantinople, and the Iberian Peninsula, with comparatively little response from the Latin Church in the West. Really, they couldn't respond because it was all they could do to protect themselves from the already constant attacks by Islam, and the fact that they at times were powerless. Fractious tribes of Goths ruled the lands of Europe, and the Roman Empire had breathed its last. Within only 100 years of the formation of the faith, the entirety of the Bible lands fell to Islam. Jerusalem, the city of the great King David and Jesus Christ himself. All of North Africa fell, and Spain, and the entire Iberian Peninsula. In fact, all of the Latin world may have fallen too, were it not for Charles the Hammer Martel at the Battle of Tours, handing the Moors a decisive defeat that drew a clear boundary that Muslims could not pass. Had it not been for the strong leadership of Pepin, Charles, and their whole line down through Charles's grandson Charlemagne, even today's globe may look very different. In reality, the rise of Islam was just as large of a factor for the ushering in of what became the Dark Ages than anything else. Most textbook definitions focus the term Dark Ages on lack of leadership in Western Europe. Today's historians believe that Western Europe was caught in the grip of ignorance and disease while ignoring the complete annihilation of millions and the fall of important Christian cities in less than a century to Islamic caliphs. Ironically, the same Western intellectuals accuse these supposed disease-ridden backwoodsmen of going on an imperialist jaunt into the Holy Land to take everything from the peaceful, unassuming Muslims. So were Western Europeans of the 8th century ignorant, poor, disease-ridden fools? Or were they powerful enough to impose their imperialistic and colonialistic will on peaceful, unassuming Arabs? As Islam grew, all through history, and even today, the faith has been marred by infighting, the stronger overtaking the weaker, and constant changes in leadership. The Sunni and Shiite dominate the globe today and hate each other. The Arabic Muslims don't truly accept other Muslims as true to the faith unless they have read the Quran in Arabic. Sunni do not consider Shiite Muslims to even be Muslims. This is a stern position considering the Arabic Muslims represent only about 1/5 of the world's Islamic population. Yet, one can liken the average Muslim to the average Christian, sadly, who mutually seem to think that Christians killed Muslims during the Crusades without really looking into any context or primary source. If the Crusaders were such barbarians for their aggression toward Muslims in the Holy Land, one must next wonder, how did Islam end up in Christian regions to begin with? How did they end up in what had historically been Hebrew and Jewish regions? The period of the Dark Ages was also defined because of the emergence of the plague, which killed 1/3 of the population in Europe, all told. Other historians define the Dark Ages as a period when the Word of God was closed off from the people at large and controlled through the Latin Church in the West. Literacy was particularly low, and the cultural elements that defined a society's level of civilization would suffer from the combination of disease and resettling of tribal powers all over the map. The rise of Islam upset the balance of growth and development in Asia Minor, the Mediterranean, and Europe. By the end of the 7th century, the Muslim tribes under Muhammad's father-in-law Abu Bakr and his brother-in-law Ali left their homeland to embark on what all told would amount to over 550 battles against Europe, Africa, India, the Middle East, and the Baltic. Specifically for Christians, the result was millions of Christians being sold into slavery and 60 million being killed. This, of course, does not include the 260 millions of Hindus, Buddhists, and various Kafirs killed by Muslims. The brutality of Islam sent shockwaves through the world when they attacked Sind and killed 26,000 Hindus. Armenian Christians were a particular target, and no mercy was shown. The Muslims sacked Ephesus and captured 700 Greeks to be sold into slavery. In a relatively short period of time, the lands of the Bible were firmly Islamic.